The 24th of March, 1986. A concrete bunker buried in the coastal sands outside Sirte, Libya. Inside, the air is stale, thick with the smell of ozone and hot electronics. This is the nerve center of an SA-5 Gammon long-range surface-to-air missile battery. The crew, trained by Soviet advisors, operates with a practiced confidence. Their equipment is the pride of the Soviet Vojska PVO, the air defense forces. Their radar, the massive square-pair engagement system, is a technological marvel, capable of reaching out hundreds of kilometers to swat American intruders from the sky. They are the guardians of Colonel Gaddafi's line of death across the Gulf of Sidra. They are, in their minds, invincible. The senior operator leans forward. On his green phosphorus screen, a series of small blips appears, tracking south, heading directly for them. American carrier aircraft. The mood in the bunker shifts from boredom to a tense excitement. This is what they trained for. The commander gives the order. The operator's fingers dance across the consoles, and deep within the bunker, high-voltage transmitters hum to life. The square-pair radar ceases its sweeping search and locks onto the lead American target, painting it with an intense, focused beam of electromagnetic energy. The launch keys are armed. The operators are seconds away from firing. Then, something impossible happens. A new tone shrieks in the operator's headsets, a warning receiver they didn't even know was being monitored. It's a signal they don't recognize. On the screen, a new contact appears, moving at a speed that defies logic over Mach 2. It's not an aircraft. It's small, and it's vectoring directly, impossibly, at them. It's climbing right up their own radar beam. Panic, the commander screams. But at what? To shut down? To fire? It's too late. The screen flashes white, overwhelmed by a torrent of electronic noise. Then, utter blackness. The consoles are dead. For a fraction of a second, there is a profound, terrifying silence. And then the bunker is struck by the force of a locomotive. The shockwave tosses the men like dolls, and the concrete walls crack. The square-pair antenna array, their sword and shield, has been vaporized. The fortress has been breached. The hunters have just become the hunted. If you want to understand the true, behind-the-scenes stories of Cold War impact, subscribe to this channel. To understand the depth of the shock in that Libyan bunker, one must first understand the depth of the Soviet confidence. This confidence was born on May 1st, 1960. On that day, a high-altitude American U-2 spy plane, flown by Francis Gary Powers, was struck by a salvo of new SA-2 guideline missiles over Sverdlovsk. The shoot-down was a global humiliation for the United States. For the Soviet Union, it was a profound victory. It proved that their air defense doctrine, built on a dense, layered, and radar-guided network of surface-to-air missiles, was the answer to American air power. This belief became a central pillar of Soviet military strategy. The Vojska PVO was not just a part of the Air Force, it was its own co-equal branch of the armed services. They built a wall of SAMs around the Soviet Union, and its client states that was, they claimed, impenetrable. This doctrine was tested and hardened in the skies over North Vietnam. American pilots, flying Phone 105 seconds and F-4 seconds, learned to fear the flying telephone poles of the SA-2. The US Air Force and Navy paid a heavy price for every mission, losing hundreds of aircraft to the Soviet-supplied SAM network. The PVO strategy was proven: build a dense enough web of radar, and you can deny the sky to anyone. Their radar was their all-seeing eye, their sword, and their shield. But in Washington, at the Pentagon, and at the Naval Weapons Center at China Lake, California, a different lesson was being learned. The losses over Vietnam were agonizing. The American response was a desperate, high-risk gambit called the Wild Weasel program. The concept was borderline suicidal. Take a fighter bomber, add specialized electronics, and have it fly ahead of the main strike force. Its job was to troll for enemy SAM sites, to intentionally draw fire. When a Vietnamese radar operator locked onto the Wild Weasel, the Weasel's crew would, in theory, fire a missile back at the radar site to destroy it. The first missile they used was the AGM-45 Shrike. It was a partial success, but it had a critical, fatal flaw. The Shrike was a simple weapon. It just homed in on whatever radar frequency it was pointed at. The moment a savvy Soviet or Vietnamese operator realized a Shrike was in the air, he would simply turn his radar off. The Shrike, its guidance signal gone, would fly dumb and miss. The Wild Weasel crews, flying the F-105G and later the F-4G, were playing a terrifying game of chicken with men on the ground. It was a game they often lost. The Americans needed a true phantom. They didn't just need a missile that reacted. They needed a missile that hunted. The project began in the mid-1970s, a joint venture between Texas Instruments and the Navy. The requirement was simple, but the technology it demanded was revolutionary. The new missile had to be fast, very fast. It had to have a broadband seeker, one that could see and target any radar frequency, from the low-band search radars to the high-band fire control radars. But most importantly, it had to solve the shutdown problem. It needed to have a memory. The result was the AGM-88, High-Speed Anti-Radiation Missile, HARM. It was a sleek, white spear of technology that was, in every way, a predator. Its rocket motor propelled it at over 1,500 miles per hour. Its sophisticated passive seeker could scan the entire enemy electronic order of battle. And deep within its digital processor, it had an inertial guidance system. This was the phantom in the machine. Here is how it worked. An American pilot, in his F, divided by A-18 or A7, would detect the emissions from a Soviet-built SA-5 radar. He would designate that signal and fire the HARM. The missile would leap off the rail, screaming toward the source of that energy. Back in the bunker, the Libyan operator would see the inbound attack warning. He would do exactly what his Soviet trainers had taught him to do. He would shut his radar off. But the HARM didn't care. The instant the signal died, the HARM's internal guidance system registered the exact latitude and longitude of where that radar used to be. It then flew the rest of the way on its own, navigating by memory. This one feature changed everything. It created an unwinnable catch-22 for every Soviet-trained radar operator on Earth. If you turn your radar on, you will be targeted, and you will die. If you turn your radar off, you will still die. The HARM missile wasn't just a weapon aimed at a piece of equipment. It was a psychological weapon, aimed directly at the mind of the man at the console. It turned the Soviet Union's greatest military strength, its impenetrable wall of radar, into its single greatest vulnerability. The world inside the SA-5 command bunker dissolved into a nightmare of pulverized concrete and shrieking metal. The overpressure from the HARM's warhead, exploding just meters above their square-pair radar, had sent a seismic shock through the earth. For the men who survived, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the blast. The green glow of the consoles was gone, replaced by the acrid smoke of burnt-out electronics. The link to their missiles was severed. Their all-seeing eye was blind. This was not an isolated incident. This was the opening salvo of Operation Prairie Fire. Within minutes, other SAM sites along the Libyan coast lit up their own radars, frantically searching the sky for the attackers. And one by one they were met by the same high-speed, silent predators. 7 Corsair II pilots from the USS Saratoga and America were wild weasels reborn. But they weren't the desperate decoys of Vietnam. They were hunters. They carried the HARM, and as soon as a Libyan operator's beam touched their aircraft, they had a lock. The radio chatter from the Libyan Air Defense Network, monitored by American electronic warfare aircraft, descended from confident professionalism into raw, unadulterated panic. Operators were screaming for orders. Should they engage? Should they shut down? The orders that came back were contradictory and confused. Some operators kept their radars on, a fatal act of bravery, and were obliterated. Others shut down, plunging their own commanders into total blindness, leaving the skies wide open for the inbound American strike aircraft. The entire, multi-billion-dollar Soviet-built air defense system, the very shield of the nation, was not just penetrated, it was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, in a matter of minutes. The chase was inverted. The Libyans weren't chasing the Americans. They were being chased by an invisible enemy that rode on their own radar beams. A SAM operator's only move was to go dark and prey. Now contrast this terror with the scene inside the cockpit of a Navy A-7E Corsair II, callsign Rampager 305, flying high above the dark waters of the Gulf of Sidra. The pilot is a professional. His world is not one of panic, but of calm, methodical process. On his instrument panel, a small, specialized screen, the AN divided by ALR 45 radar warning receiver, comes to life. A symbol for an SA-5 appears, and a digitized tone in his helmet tells him he's being painted. 10 years prior, this sound would have meant imminent death. He would be braking hard, dumping flares and chaff, his heart pounding in his chest. Instead, he makes a small adjustment to his course. He selects the HARM missile on his weapons panel. A new symbol, a diamond, appears on his heads-up display, perfectly bracketing the source of the enemy radar. He presses a single button on his control stick. Magnum, he reports calmly over the radio. A white streak leaps from his wing and vanishes into the darkness below, accelerating past Mach 2. He feels no recoil. He doesn't need to see the target. He doesn't need to guide the missile. He simply turns away, his time on target complete. He has just single-handedly destroyed a multi-million-dollar missile installation whose crew, trained by the best instructors the Soviet Union could provide, never even knew he was there. His systems are already scanning for the next target. This was the humiliation. It was not just a defeat, it was a total invalidation. The Soviets had spent decades and poured billions of rubles into a doctrine that was rendered obsolete in a single night by a piece of technology they hadn't even conceived of. The Americans had created a weapon that turned the PVO's greatest strength into a fatal weakness. The Americans weren't avoiding the SAMs, as they had in Vietnam. They were hunting them. The psychological impact on the Libyan crews, and on their Soviet advisors who reviewed the after-action reports, was profound. It was an act of supreme technological contempt. The Americans had effectively declared, "Turn on your radar, please, we want you to." They had turned the impenetrable wall into a graveyard, marked by the smoking craters of radar dishes. The HARM missile didn't just break the Libyan air defense system, it broke the spirit of the men who operated it. They were technologically checkmated. Their best weapon was now nothing more than a come-and-kill-me beacon. The 1986 strikes on Libya were not an end. They were a beginning. The terrifying success of the AGM-88 HARM confirmed what its designers had promised. The era of the static, radar-guided SAM fortress was over. The Wild Weasel crews, once the sacrificial lambs of the Air Force, had become the apex predators. This success was rapidly codified, transforming from a single mission capability into the very foundation of American air power doctrine. It was given a name: SED, or Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses. From this point forward, no American war plan would ever again begin with the question, how do we avoid the enemy's air defenses? It would begin with the statement, first, we destroy them. The HARM missile was integrated into a wider, deadlier system. It was paired with the new F-4G Wild Weasel V, an aircraft packed with a sophisticated avionics suite designed specifically to sniff out, categorize, and target every enemy radar in a 100-mile radius. In the Navy, it became the primary weapon of the F, divided by A-18 Hornet and the A-6 Intruder. This system of aircraft, sensors, and missiles was a perfect, self-contained feedback loop of destruction. The enemy radar was the target, its own energy was the guidance, and its operator was the victim. The Soviet Union had built an iron curtain of electronics, and the United States had just turned it into a massive electrical grid, one they could now short-circuit at will. The first true test of this new, systematic doctrine came on January 17, 1991. The target was Iraq. Saddam Hussein, with massive Soviet and French assistance, had built Kari, an integrated air defense system that was, on paper, one of the most formidable on the planet. It was a dense, redundant, and technologically modern network of SA-2 seconds, SA-3 seconds, SA-6 seconds, and French Roland missiles, all tied together by a central command and control system. The Iraqi operators, many trained in the Soviet Union, were confident. They expected a repeat of Vietnam. They got a repeat of Libya, magnified 1,000 times. The opening shots of Operation Desert Storm were not bombs. They were a coordinated, massive salvo of HARM missiles. US Air Force F-4Gs and Navy F, divided by A-18 seconds, streaked across the border, their sensors drinking in the electronic data as the entire KARI network lit up to meet them. In bunkers across Iraq, operators watched their screens, identifying targets, preparing to fire. Then, the Magnum calls began. An Iraqi operator in a bunker outside Baghdad would have seen his scope fill with targets. He would have locked onto one, a high-speed contact. And then, his warning receiver would have screamed. A HARM was in the air, hunting him. He had a choice: shut down and let the American strike package fly overhead unopposed, or keep his radar on and die. Most chose to shut down. The few who kept their beams active were systematically snuffed out. Within the first hour of the war, the Kari system was not just damaged, it was rendered comatose. The Iraqi air defense network, the shield of the nation, had collapsed. The highway of death was made possible because the HARM missile had already blinded the eyes that were supposed to be protecting it. The lesson was not lost on the rest of the world. By 1999, during Operation Allied Force in the Balkans, the Serbian military, under Slobodan Milosevic, had adapted. They knew from Desert Storm that to turn on a radar for more than a few seconds was suicide. They adopted new tactics, learned from their Soviet advisors. They kept their missiles hidden, firing them in ambush mode. They would power up their radar for just 30 seconds, acquire a target, fire, and then immediately shut down and move. They believed this shoot-and-scoot tactic would defeat the HARM. They were wrong. The American system had also adapted. The F-16CJ, the new face of the Wild Weasel, now carried the HARM. And its pilots used the missile in a terrifying new way. Flying over Serbia, a pilot wouldn't wait to be targeted. Using intelligence to identify a suspected SAM location, he would fire the HARM preemptively in a mode called Target of Opportunity. The missile would fly to the pre-programmed coordinates, but its seeker would be active, hunting. The Serbian operator, hidden below, would see the NATO strike package approaching. He would be tempted. He would power up his radar for just a few seconds, just long enough to get a lock. And the HARM, already in the air, would instantly see that new signal, pivot in mid-flight, and dive on him. The Serbs had created a pop-up defense. The Americans had created a pop-up offense. It was the ultimate catch-22 all over again. This brings us to the haunting element, the symbol of this new dominance. It wasn't a physical thing like the SR-71's sonic boom. It was a word, a single, calm, professional radio call. Magnum. In the doctrine of American air power, Magnum is the brevity code for the launch of an anti-radiation missile. For any enemy radar operator, for any intelligence officer monitoring US tactical frequencies, this one word became the most terrifying sound of the modern era. It was not the shriek of a bomb or the roar of an afterburner. It was the calm, methodical voice of a pilot announcing that an invisible, hypersonic predator was now on its way. The word Magnum signified that you had been seen. It signified that a missile you could not track, could not jam, and could not escape was now climbing up your own energy beam. It meant you had less than a minute to make a choice, go blind or die. When the HARM was in the air, the entire multi-billion ruble Soviet air defense doctrine was reduced to a single panic gesture, the off switch. Magnum was the sound of forced silence. It was the sound of total, systemic, and psychological defeat. The after-action reports from Operation Prairie Fire landed on desks in Moscow like grenades. They were not reports of a simple tactical loss. They were obituaries for a doctrine. The data was analyzed, reanalyzed, and finally, grudgingly, believed. The Americans had not just bypassed the Libyan SAM network, they had eaten it alive. The Soviet advisors, in their secret debriefs to the GRU and the high command of the Vojska PVO, described a level of panic and systemic collapse that was previously unimaginable. They wrote of operators, trained at the best Soviet academies, who were rendered completely impotent, forced to choose between blindness and annihilation. This was not just a military problem, it was an existential one. The Soviet Union's global influence was built on two pillars, its nuclear arsenal and the perceived invincibility of its conventional air defenses. Nations like Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, and Vietnam had spent their entire military budgets on Soviet hardware, creating client states dependent on Moscow for protection. Now, in a single night, the United States had proven that this protection was a lie. The impenetrable wall was a paper tiger. The HARM missile wasn't just destroying radars, it was destroying the very foundation of Soviet foreign policy and its multi-billion-dollar arms export industry. The Politburo was faced with a terrifying realization: their most valuable military product was now obsolete. A wave of desperate innovation began. The first response was not technological, it was tactical. Soviet planners, studying the HARM's memory function, devised a new strategy: shoot and scoot. SAM crews were retrained. They were ordered to never stay in one place for more than a few hours. They were to power up, acquire a target, fire, and then immediately shut down and move. This, the generals believed, would defeat the HARM. If the missile flew to the radar's last known location, it would find nothing but an empty patch of dirt. This tactic was drilled relentlessly, and it was the new doctrine exported to their allies, most notably to the Serbs in the 1990s. But this was a stopgap. The real big bet, the great technological hope of the Soviet air defense forces, was already on the drawing board. It was a system designed to be the ultimate harm killer. It was the S-300, known to NATO as the SA-10 Grumble. The S-300 was a complete philosophical break from the past. The old SA-2 seconds and SA-5 seconds were static, cumbersome beasts that took hours or even days to set up. The S-300 was entirely mobile. Its components, the command vehicle, the engagement radar, and the missile launchers were all mounted on massive 8x8 trucks. A trained crew could deploy the entire battery, from a dead stop on a highway to ready to fire in less than 5 minutes. This was the scoot part of shoot and scoot, elevated to a technological art form. But the real revolution was in its radar. It was a phased array system, the flap lid by NATO's designation. It didn't have a big spinning dish. It was a flat, digital-looking panel that could steer its beams electronically, tracking dozens of targets simultaneously. More importantly, it was a low probability of intercept, or LPI, radar. It didn't just blast one single powerful frequency like the old systems. It hopped across a wide spectrum of frequencies, hundreds of times per second, using complex waveforms that were, in theory, almost impossible for a harm seeker to lock onto. It was designed to be a whisper in a room full of noise. This was the Soviet big bet, a system so fast, so mobile, and so electronically subtle that the wild weasels would be blind to it. But this solution was, itself, fundamentally flawed. First, the laws of physics are absolute. To guide a missile to a target several miles away, a whisper is not enough. At the moment of engagement, the flap lid had to focus a powerful, high-energy beam on the American aircraft. For that brief, fatal instant, its low-probability signal became a very high-probability beacon. It was a momentary shout in the dark, but it was all the Americans needed. The United States had not been idle. While the Soviets were building the S-300, American engineers were upgrading the HARM. The AGM-8, 8B and C models were given new software and more advanced digital seekers. And, crucially, the F-16 was equipped with the Harm Targeting System, or HTS pod. This pod was a super-sensitive receiver that could scan the entire electromagnetic spectrum. It could detect even the brief, frequency-hopping emissions from an S-300. It didn't just hear the shout, it could hear the whisper. The HTS pod could get a precise geolocation on the S-300 radar without the F-16 pilot ever turning on his own radar. The pilot could then launch the HARM in a new pre-briefed mode. The missile, already knowing the S-300's exact location, would fly there on inertial guidance. It would arrive on station, right above the hidden SAM site, and then turn on its own seeker, hunting for that final, fatal transmission. The Soviets had built a faster-moving shell. The Americans had built a faster-thinking P. The technological checkmate remained. The second flaw was economic. The S-300 was a marvel, but it was colossally expensive. The Soviet command economy, already cracking under the strain of the arms race, could not afford to build them in the numbers needed. They could place a few batteries around Moscow and other high-value sites, but they could never replace the thousands of older, now useless SAMs littering the Eastern Bloc. The impenetrable wall was now, at best, a few impenetrable islands in a sea of total American dominance. The killer statistic that proved the utter failure of the Soviet countermeasure came during the 1999 war in Kosovo. The Serbian military, using Soviet-supplied SA-6 seconds, employed the shoot-and-scoot doctrine perfectly. They were disciplined, well-trained, and fighting on their home turf. Over 78 days of a sustained round-the-clock air campaign, NATO aircraft flew more than 38,000 combat sorties. The Serbians, with one of the most robust air defense networks in Europe, fired hundreds of missiles. They succeeded in shooting down exactly 2 NATO aircraft. 2. In exchange, harm-firing aircraft methodically hunted and destroyed the vast majority of their active radar sites, rendering the entire air defense system blind and irrelevant. The loss ratio was so lopsided, it was a joke. The tactical countermeasure was a proven failure. The psychological toll of this reality was devastating. The Vojska PVO, once the most prestigious posting in the Soviet military, had become a hollow institution. Its core doctrine was a failure. Its operators, the supposed guardians of the sky, were now trained not to fight. Their primary survival skill was to keep their radar, their only weapon, turned off. A culture of radar phobia set in. To be brave, to be aggressive, to do your job, was to commit suicide. A corrosive, deeply held sense of technological inferiority and impotence rotted the PVO from the inside out. They were a shield, and they knew, with cold certainty, that the shield was broken. The HARM missile did not, by itself, end the Cold War, but the technological and psychological chasm it exposed was a symptom of the terminal disease that did. The failure of the Soviet SAM network was not a singular, isolated flaw. It was a perfect, micro-level example of the systemic, ideological rot at the heart of the entire Soviet command economy. The Soviet system, ruled by fear and centralized bureaucracy, was brilliant at one thing: imitation. It could see a B-29 bomber and, through espionage and brute force engineering, produce a Tupolev Tu-4. It could see the American space shuttle and produce the Buran. But this was a system built to react. It was a system that could copy, but it could not innovate. It could not produce the kind of disruptive, paradigm-shifting ideas that emerged from the garages of Silicon Valley or the skunk works laboratories of American aerospace. The AGM-88 HARM was precisely such an idea. It was a product of intellectual freedom, a weapon born from a culture that gave its engineers the liberty to ask a truly radical question. What if, instead of dodging the radar, we built a missile smart enough to hunt it? This was not a linear improvement. It was a conceptual leap, a total inversion of the problem. It was a weapon of ingenuity, not just brute force. The Soviet countermeasure, the S-300, was, by contrast, a masterpiece of brute force. It was a bigger, faster, more complex version of the same old idea, a radar-guided missile. It was the ultimate, most expensive expression of a failed doctrine. It was an attempt to build a stronger, thicker, faster-moving wall at the exact moment the Americans had invented a ghost that could pass right through it. The HARM was a scalpel. The S-300 was a heavier hammer. And in this new war of digital logic and microprocessors, the scalpel would always win. This technological failure was a direct reflection of the ideological one. A system that punishes dissent and independent thought cannot compete with one that rewards it. The Soviet command economy could pour all its resources into building a perfect missile, but it could not generate the spark of creativity that rendered that missile obsolete before it even left the factory. The HARM missile proved that American innovation, driven by freedom and competition, was operating at a level the Soviet system could not even comprehend, let alone match. The guardians of the wall, the Vojska PVO, had been defeated not by a faster missile, but by a superior idea. The ultimate, symbolic proof of this systemic failure did not come from the skies over Libya or Iraq. It came from the streets of Berlin on the 9th of November, 1989. The Berlin Wall was the ultimate expression of the Soviet doctrine. It was a static, brutal, impenetrable air defense system for an entire population. It was designed to keep its people in, just as the SAM networks were designed to keep the Americans out. It was a wall of concrete, barbed wire, and machine gun towers, an analog fortress in a digital world. And when it fell not to a tank battalion or a bomber wing. It fell to an idea. It fell to the uncontainable, unstoppable pressure of a people who had seen the other side on television, on the radio, and in the very airwaves the wall was meant to block, and simply decided that the lie was over. They breached the wall with hammers, with chisels, and with their bare hands. They didn't overpower the guards, they invalidated them. The guards, like the SAM operators, had been trained to fight a frontal assault, but they had no defense against a population that had simply lost its fear and decided to walk free. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the HARM missile's victory, written in concrete. It was the ultimate magnum call for an entire ideology. It proved that a system built on total control, brute force, and the suppression of the human spirit is, in the end, a fortress with no foundation. It is a shield that, when struck by a truly new idea, shatters into 1,000 pieces. The Cold War was, in the end, a long, grim duel between two opposing ideas. One, that the state was absolute, and that mankind must be controlled, contained, and shielded by walls of steel and concrete. The other, that the individual was absolute, and that mankind must be free to innovate, to challenge, and to tear those walls down. The wreckage of the square pair radar, left smoking in the Libyan sand, was a monument to the first idea. It was a testament to the fact that any system, however powerful, that relies on a central switch can be defeated by an enemy who is smart enough to target that switch. The HARM missile was a weapon, yes, but it was also a prophecy. It was a 9-foot-long, 800-pound piece of evidence that a society that builds its defenses on fear and control will, inevitably, be rendered obsolete by a society that builds its future on freedom and ingenuity. The wall, whether it was made of radar beams or of concrete blocks, was always destined to fall.